The kitchen was spotless. Margaret had made sure of that before sitting down at the table. The afternoon light filtered through white curtains, casting soft shadows across the floor. Everything looked peaceful, normal, but the silence in that room felt like glass about to shatter. Across from her sat Dorothy, her mother-in-law, hands folded neatly on the table, face calm as still water. And beside Dorothy, barely 3 feet away, sat Michael, Margaret's husband, the man who promised to stand by her through everything. He wasn't looking at her now. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid. Dorothy spoke without raising her voice. No anger, no shouting, just cold, measured words. You can either do things the way I've taught you, Margaret, or you can leave. But you will not disrespect me in my son's home. Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to speak, wanted to scream, wanted Michael to say something, anything. But he didn't. He just sat there, silent. And in that silence, Margaret felt something inside her crack. She didn't know it yet, but her life had just changed forever. Hi friends, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Canada? United States? United Kingdom? Or Jamaica? We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happens when the person who's supposed to protect you becomes the one who abandons you? How long can a woman endure being silenced in her own marriage before something inside her breaks? And what does it cost a man when he chooses his mother over his wife, over and over again, until there's nothing left to save? Margaret had asked herself these questions for years. She had swallowed her pride, bitten her tongue, and convinced herself that love meant sacrifice, that patience would be rewarded, that eventually Michael would see her, really see her. But that afternoon, sitting at that table, watching her husband avoid her eyes while his mother delivered an ultimatum, Margaret realized something she had been too afraid to admit. She wasn't in a marriage. She was in a hierarchy, and she was at the bottom. The question wasn't whether she would leave. The question was whether she had the strength to choose herself when no one else would. What would you do if the person you loved most couldn't stand up for you? Could you walk away? Or would you stay and hope things would change? Margaret had always been the kind of woman people liked. Soft-spoken, but not weak. Patient, but not passive. She worked as a third-grade teacher, the kind who remembered every student's birthday and stayed late to help the ones who struggled. When she met Michael at a friend's wedding 7 years ago, she thought she'd found someone steady, someone kind. He was a financial analyst, responsible, respectful, the type of man who opened doors and called when he said he would. Their courtship was sweet. Quiet dinners, long walks, conversations that felt easy. He talked about wanting a family, about building something solid and real. And Margaret believed him. She didn't meet Dorothy until after the engagement. Michael had mentioned his mother often, always with a tone of deep respect. She sacrificed everything for me, he'd say. Raised me on her own after my dad left. I owe her everything. Margaret admired that. She thought it showed character. Loyalty. She didn't realize loyalty could become a cage. The wedding was beautiful. Dorothy sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, smiling through what looked like tears of joy. But Margaret noticed something that day. During the vows, Dorothy's smile had faltered, just for a moment. And when Michael kissed his bride, Dorothy looked away. Margaret told herself she was imagining things. The first year of marriage was manageable. Dorothy called often. Too often, maybe, but Margaret tried to be understanding. Michael would drop everything to help his mother with errands, bills, doctor's appointments. She's getting older, he'd explain. I'm all she has. Margaret nodded. She wanted to be supportive. But the calls started coming during dinner, during date nights, during the quiet moments that were supposed to be just theirs. And Michael always answered. Always. Dorothy had opinions about everything. The way Margaret decorated their apartment, the meals she cooked, the way she folded Michael's shirts. At first, the critiques were framed as suggestions. Gentle advice from a mother who just wanted to help. But the tone shifted. The suggestions became corrections. The corrections became expectations. And Margaret, wanting to keep the peace, tried to meet them. She changed her cooking, rearranged the furniture, bought the detergent Dorothy recommended. But it was never enough. There was always something else. Something Margaret was doing wrong. And whenever she tried to talk to Michael about it, he brushed it off. She means well. She's just set in her ways. Don't take it personally. But how could she not take it personally when every conversation with Dorothy felt like an evaluation she was failing? Then they had a daughter, Emma. The moment Margaret held her, she felt something shift inside her. A fierce, overwhelming protectiveness. She thought becoming a mother would change things. That Dorothy would soften. That Michael would finally step into his role as a husband and father, not just a son. But it got worse. Dorothy insisted on being in the delivery room. Michael didn't see the problem. Dorothy criticized the name they chose. Michael stayed silent. Dorothy had strong opinions about breastfeeding, sleep schedules, and what kind of toys Emma should have. And when Margaret tried to make her own decisions, Dorothy would call Michael at work. He'd come home tense, distant, and ask Margaret if she could just try it Dorothy's way to avoid conflict. Margaret started to feel like a guest in her own life. Every choice she made was questioned. Every boundary she set was challenged. And Michael, the man who vowed to stand by her, seemed to evaporate whenever his mother entered the room. At night, when Emma finally slept, Margaret would lie awake and wonder if this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. Lonely, invisible, like she was drowning in silence while everyone around her pretended the water was calm. It started with small things. Dorothy would come over unannounced and rearrange Margaret's kitchen. "You'll thank me later," she'd say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret would find her parenting books moved, her routines ignored, her authority as a mother quietly undermined. When Emma was 18 months old, Margaret set a bedtime routine. Bath at 7, story at 7:30, lights out by 8. It worked. Emma slept through the night, and Margaret finally had a few hours to herself. But one evening, Dorothy was visiting and decided Emma didn't need to go to bed so early. "She's not even tired," Dorothy said, scooping Emma up despite Margaret's protest. Michael was sitting right there. Margaret looked at him, waiting. He glanced at his mother, then at Margaret, and said nothing. Emma stayed up until 10 that night, cranky and overstimulated. The next day, the routine was ruined. It took Margaret 2 weeks to get it back on track. When she tried to talk to Michael about it, he sighed. "She's just trying to bond with Emma. Why do you have to make everything so difficult?" Margaret felt something harden inside her. Difficult. That word stayed with her. She wasn't being difficult. She was being a mother. But to Michael, setting a boundary with his mother was an inconvenience. An overreaction. The incidents piled up. Dorothy bought Emma clothes Margaret didn't like and insisted she wear them. Dorothy fed Emma candy before dinner, even after Margaret asked her not to. Dorothy told Emma that Mommy worries too much and that Grandma knows best. And every time Margaret tried to address it, Michael minimized it. "It's not a big deal. She's just excited to be a grandmother. You're being too sensitive." But Margaret wasn't being sensitive. She was being erased. And the worst part was that Michael couldn't see it. Or wouldn't. One afternoon, Margaret planned a small birthday party for Emma's second birthday. Just close family and a few friends. She baked a cake, decorated the living room, and bought Emma a little dress she'd been saving for. Dorothy arrived early, carrying a bigger cake, fancier decorations, and a different dress. "I thought we could do it this way instead," Dorothy said brightly. Margaret stood there, holding her homemade cake, feeling ridiculous, feeling small. She looked at Michael. He was smiling at his mother, thanking her for going to so much trouble. He didn't even glance at Margaret. That night, after everyone left, Margaret cried in the bathroom. Not because of the cake, but because she realized that in her own home, at her own daughter's birthday party, she didn't matter. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. Margaret had been up since 5:30 with Emma, who had a cold and was fussy. Michael slept in. Dorothy called at 9, asking Michael to come fix her kitchen sink. He agreed immediately, without asking Margaret if she needed help. By the time he left, Margaret was exhausted, covered in spit up, trying to soothe a crying toddler while cleaning up breakfast. Dorothy called again 2 hours later, this time asking to speak to Margaret. Her tone was clipped. "Cold. I need to talk to you about how you're raising Emma." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. Dorothy launched into a list. Emma wasn't being taught manners. She was too attached to Margaret. She wasn't being socialized properly. And the way Margaret handled discipline was too soft, too permissive, too emotional. Margaret tried to respond calmly, but her voice shook. "Dorothy, I appreciate your concern, but Michael and I are handling it." There was a pause. Then Dorothy said, "Michael agrees with me." Margaret felt the room tilt. "He what? We've talked about it. He's worried too. He just doesn't want to hurt your feelings." Margaret hung up. Her hands were shaking. Her chest felt tight. When Michael came home that evening, she confronted him. Did you tell your mother you're worried about how I'm raising Emma? He froze. Looked guilty. She asked me. I didn't want to lie. Margaret stared at him. So instead of talking to me, your wife, you talked to your mother? About our daughter? He rubbed his face, frustrated. You're twisting this. She just cares, Margaret. Why can't you see that? Why can't you see that I'm drowning? Margaret's voice cracked. I'm doing everything, Michael. Everything. And instead of supporting me, you're talking behind my back with your mother like I'm some kind of problem to be solved. He didn't apologize. He just looked tired, annoyed, like she was making a big deal out of nothing. Again, that night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized something she'd been avoiding for years. Michael wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to choose her. He wasn't going to stand up to his mother. And if she stayed, this was her life. Forever. The next day, Dorothy showed up unannounced. She walked into the kitchen where Margaret was feeding Emma lunch and sat down at the table without being invited. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. We need to talk, Dorothy said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Michael came in from the living room and sat down beside his mother. He didn't look at Margaret. And that's when Dorothy said it. You can either follow my guidance, Margaret, or you can leave. But I will not allow you to disrespect me in my son's home. If you've ever felt invisible in your own marriage, type, I'm still watching in the comments. Let's talk about this. Margaret sat frozen. Her daughter was in her high chair, smearing mashed bananas on the tray, completely unaware that her mother's world was collapsing. Dorothy's words hung in the air like smoke. My son's home. Not their home. Not the home Margaret cleaned, decorated, and poured her heart into. Michael's home. And Dorothy's rules. Margaret's eyes moved to Michael. Surely, now he would say something. Surely, this was too far. But he wouldn't look at her. His jaw was clenched, his hands flat on the table, his gaze fixed somewhere just past her shoulder. He was a statue, a coward carved from silence. Margaret's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. Michael. He didn't respond. Michael, look at me. Finally, slowly, his eyes met hers. And in them, she saw everything she needed to know. Guilt. Shame. But no courage. No fight. He wasn't going to defend her. He never had. And he never would. Dorothy stood, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. I'll give you some time to think about it, she said, as if she were offering a generous gift. Then she walked out, leaving Margaret and Michael sitting in the ruins of their marriage. Emma giggled, oblivious. Margaret wanted to scream. Instead, she stood, lifted Emma out of the high chair, and walked to the bedroom. She closed the door, sat on the floor, and let the tears come. Not loud, gasping sobs. Just silent, exhausted crying. The kind that comes when you've been holding everything in for so long that your body finally gives up. Michael didn't come after her. He never did. That night, after Emma was asleep, Margaret sat in the dark living room and made a list in her mind. Not of reasons to stay. She'd made that list 100 times. This time, she listed the costs. The cost of staying was her dignity, her voice, her sense of self. The cost of leaving was uncertainty, fear, judgment, being a single mother, starting over. But as she sat there in the silence, she realized something that changed everything. The cost of staying was higher, because if she stayed, she would teach her daughter that this was normal. That love looked like silence. That marriage meant disappearing. And Margaret couldn't do that. She wouldn't. The next morning, she called her sister, Rebecca. Rebecca had always been the strong one, the one who spoke her mind and took no nonsense from anyone. When Margaret told her what happened, Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You know what you need to do, don't you? Margaret closed her eyes. Yeah, I do. Do you need help? Margaret's throat tightened. Yeah, I'll be there tomorrow. Rebecca showed up the next afternoon with boxes, trash bags, and a rental van. Margaret had told Michael that morning, in the kitchen, over coffee, that she was leaving. He looked at her like she'd just told him the sky was falling. You're overreacting, he said. This is insane, Margaret. You're going to break up our family over this. Margaret set down her mug. Her hands were steady now. I'm not breaking up our family, Michael. You did that when you chose your mother over me. Every single time. That's not fair, isn't it? Her voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes after a storm has already passed. When's the last time you stood up for me? When's the last time you told your mother no? When's the last time you made me feel like I mattered? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I love you. Margaret nodded slowly. I know you do. But love without protection isn't love, Michael. It's just words. He didn't try to stop her when she walked out of the room. And he didn't try to stop Rebecca when she pulled up with the van. He just stood in the doorway, watching, as Margaret packed up her life and her daughter and drove away. Dorothy called that evening. Margaret didn't answer. Dorothy called Michael. He did. And for the first time in his life, Michael was alone with his mother's expectations and no one else to absorb them. The first few weeks were hard. Margaret moved into Rebecca's guest room with Emma. The space was small, but it was quiet, peaceful. No one criticized her parenting. No one questioned her choices. No one made her feel like she was failing just by existing. But the guilt was heavy. She felt it every time Emma asked for Daddy. Every time she saw a family together at the park. Every time she wondered if she'd made the right choice. Michael texted. A lot. At first, the messages were defensive. You're being unreasonable. We can work this out if you just come home. Then they were pleading. I miss you. Emma needs both of us. Please don't do this. Then they were desperate. I'll talk to my mother. I'll set boundaries. Just come back. Margaret read every message. And every time, she asked herself the same question. Do I believe him? The answer was always no. Because Michael had made promises before. And he'd broken every one. Not with malice. Just with weakness. And weakness, Margaret had learned, could be just as destructive as cruelty. She blocked his number after the 10th message in one day. She needed space. Clarity. Time to figure out who she was without him. Rebecca was her anchor. You're doing the right thing, she'd say, over and over, whenever Margaret's resolve wavered. You're showing Emma what strength looks like. Margaret wasn't sure she felt strong. Most days, she felt exhausted, sad, afraid. But she also felt something she hadn't felt in years. Free. Dorothy, apparently, did not take the separation well. According to mutual friends, she was furious, humiliated. She blamed Margaret entirely, painting herself as the devoted mother-in-law who had only tried to help. Michael, they said, was struggling. He'd lost weight, stopped going out, spent most of his time at his mother's house. Margaret felt a flicker of something. Not quite sympathy, not quite satisfaction, just sadness. Sadness for the man he could have been, the husband he should have been, but wasn't. 3 months after she left, Michael showed up at Rebecca's door. Margaret was putting Emma down for a nap when the doorbell rang. Rebecca answered. Margaret heard Michael's voice, low and strained, asking to see her. Rebecca looked back at Margaret, one eyebrow raised. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She met him on the porch. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Hey, he said. Hey, Margaret replied. They stood there in awkward silence. Finally, Michael spoke. I've been going to therapy. Margaret blinked. What? Therapy. Individual sessions. My therapist said I need to work on boundaries. And codependency. And a lot of things. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like forever. I'm sorry, Margaret. For all of it. You were right. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Part of her wanted to believe him. Wanted to hope that maybe, finally, he was waking up. But the other part of her, the part that had been broken and ignored and silenced for years, knew better. I'm glad you're getting help, Michael. I really am. But it doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't mean I'm coming back. His face fell. I know I messed up. But I'm trying. I want to fix this. You can't fix it, Margaret said gently. Because it's not broken. It was never built right in the first place. He looked at her like she'd just stabbed him. But she wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. And honesty, she'd learned, was the kindest thing she could offer. I hope you figure things out, she continued. For your sake. And for Emma's. But I can't be the one who waits around to see if you do. Michael left without another word. And Margaret closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. She didn't cry. She didn't regret it. She just felt lighter. 6 months after Margaret left, she heard through a friend that Dorothy had moved in with Michael. Permanently. At first, Margaret didn't think much of it. Of course Dorothy would move in. She'd been circling that house like a hawk for years. But then the stories started filtering back. Michael was miserable. Dorothy had taken over completely. She controlled the finances, the schedule, the meals, the cleaning. Everything. Michael couldn't make a decision without her input. Couldn't go anywhere without checking in. Couldn't even invite friends over without her approval. He had become, in every sense, what Margaret had been. A guest in his own home. And for the first time, Michael understood. He understood what it felt like to be invisible, to be controlled, to have every choice questioned and every boundary ignored. He called Margaret one night, late, his voice raw. "I get it now," he said. "I finally get it." Margaret didn't gloat, didn't lecture. She just listened. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I know," Margaret said quietly. And she meant it. She did know. But knowing didn't change anything. The damage was done. And some things, once broken, can't be put back together. Michael filed for divorce 3 months later. Not because Margaret asked him to, but because he finally realized that the life he was living wasn't one worth saving. Dorothy, reportedly, was devastated. She'd won the battle, but lost her son in the process. Margaret rebuilt her life slowly. She got her own apartment, a small 2-bedroom with a balcony where she and Emma planted flowers. She returned to teaching, finding joy again in the work she loved. She started therapy too, not because she was broken, but because she wanted to understand herself better, to heal the parts of her that had learned to stay silent. Emma thrived. She was happy, healthy, surrounded by love that didn't come with conditions. And Margaret made sure her daughter grew up knowing one thing above all else: her voice mattered. Michael stayed in therapy. He worked on himself. Slowly, painfully, he began to set boundaries with Dorothy. It wasn't easy, and it didn't fix the past, but it was a start. They co-parented civilly, not warmly, but respectfully, and that was enough. Margaret didn't hate him. She didn't wish him harm. She just let him go. And in doing so, she found herself again. The lesson wasn't that marriage is hopeless, or that mothers-in-law are villains. The lesson was simpler and harder. Love without respect is not love. Silence is not peace. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away from someone who refuses to see you. Margaret learned that, and she taught her daughter the same. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. And you are never, ever too much for someone who truly loves you. So let me ask you this. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Would you have stayed and tried to make it work? Or would you have walked away, knowing it might mean starting over from nothing? Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt invisible? Where the person who was supposed to protect you just didn't? Share your story in the comments. Let's talk about it. Because these conversations matter. And your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because trust me, the next story we're sharing will remind you that courage doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like surrender. Sometimes it looks like finally choosing yourself. Thanks for watching. And remember, your voice matters. Always.